Hey guys, tonight we begin somewhere most of you will never go and most of you would never want to go. A steel corridor, a quarter of a mile long, sealed against the North Atlantic in the dead of winter, carrying 22 people and roughly 18,000 shipping containers across the most violent ocean on Earth. Not for a week, not for a month, for 9 straight months, without a single day on solid ground. This is how sailors sleep isolated aboard a container ship through 9 harsh winter months at sea. And by the time we're done tonight, you're going to understand a kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with hard labor and everything to do with never, ever getting to fully switch off. Before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're actually enjoying yourself here. And thank you, sincerely, to the person in the comments who requested this one. I read every comment, even the ones that just say, "More ships, please." And tonight, you get your wish. Let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's genuinely one of my favorite parts of doing this, watching this small community stretch itself across every time zone on the planet, all of us awake or trying not to be, together. If you'd rather just listen without the screen, the channel is now on Spotify, links in the description. And if you want longer, ad-free nights, there's a membership option waiting for you there too. Now, dim the lights. Let the fan hum in the background like distant machinery, because that's basically what it's about to become. Get comfortable, pull the blankets up, and get ready to feel very, very grateful for a bed that doesn't move. Let's pause here a moment before we go any further. Have you ever wondered what it actually feels like to sleep while the room you're sleeping in is being lifted 40 feet in the air and dropped again, over and over, for nights on end? What it does to a person to work a job where there is no weekend, no evening off, no walk around the block to clear your head for the better part of a year. How you keep track of Tuesday when the sun doesn't rise until 10 and sets again by 3. When the ocean outside your porthole is the same gray slab of moving water it was yesterday and will be again tomorrow. And could you honestly survive 9 winter months locked inside a steel hull with the same 21 faces, 4,000 miles from the nearest hospital, the nearest phone signal, the nearest patch of solid earth? You're about to find out. Congratulations. You have just reported for duty in late September in a cold, echoing steel corridor below decks on a container ship the length of 3 football fields. Somewhere above you, a crane is lowering the last of 18,000 containers into place. And somewhere ahead of you, though you can't see it yet, winter is waiting in the middle of the North Atlantic. You don't feel the cold yet, not really, because you're still standing in port, and port air, even in late September, is nothing compared to what's coming. What you feel instead is the particular hum that lives inside a ship's hull even when it's tied up and idle, a low mechanical murmur that never fully goes quiet. Not once. Not for the next 9 months. You'll stop noticing it in a few weeks. You don't know that yet. Right now, it fills your ears the way silence fills a normal room, and you find yourself listening to it the way you'd listen to a stranger breathing too close to you on a train. Your quarters are 3 decks down, a narrow steel room with a single porthole the size of a dinner plate, a bunk bolted into the wall, a small steel desk, and a locker just wide enough for the modest collection of clothes you'll be wearing, in rotation, for the better part of a year. It is, by any ordinary standard, small. But you will come to understand, in the months ahead, that small is not the same thing as insufficient. Small, on a ship like this, is deliberate. Every inch of unused space is an inch that isn't earning its keep, and on a vessel where every gram of cargo is calculated down to the fraction, a sailor's comfort occupies exactly the footprint it's been allotted, and not 1 centimeter more. Let's talk about the ship itself, because without understanding her, nothing that happens to you over the coming winter will make sense. She is, in the most literal sense, a small, floating nation. 299 meters from bow to stern, 40 meters wide, drawing nearly 15 meters of water beneath her when fully loaded. 18 decks worth of containers stacked above her main deck like a city block turned on its side, and below the waterline, an engine larger than most suburban houses, capable of producing enough power to light a small town. And crewing all of this, moving all of this, keeping all of this alive through 9 months of the roughest ocean on the planet. 22 people. 22. You do the arithmetic without meaning to, the way anyone would. Roughly 14,000 tons of ship and cargo for every single soul aboard. It is a number that will follow you through the winter, quietly, in the back of your mind, every time something creaks in the dark that shouldn't creak, every time the ship shudders under a wave that hits her wrong. There is no one coming. Not tonight, not next week, not for months. Whatever happens out here happens to the 22 of you, and to nobody else. The ship is organized the way a small, strange town might be organized, if that town had been designed by an engineer who hated wasted motion. The bridge sits high above everything else, glass-walled and instrument-lined, the ship's mind. 3 decks down and toward the stern sits the engine room, vast and deafening and hot enough in places to blister skin, the ship's furnace of a heart. Between them, strung along narrow steel corridors that all look identical after the first week, are the crew's quarters, the galley, the mess hall, a small gym nobody quite has the energy for, and a recreation room with a television that mostly plays films everyone has already seen twice. This is the whole of your world now. Not because you've been imprisoned in it, but because outside these steel walls is the North Atlantic in October, and the North Atlantic in October does not care what you'd prefer. Tonight, your first night aboard, the ship is still tied to the dock, and the motion beneath your bunk is barely a motion at all, a faint sway you'd hardly register if someone hadn't told you to expect it. You lie there in your narrow bunk, listening to that low hum work its way into your bones, and you try to picture what the ship will feel like in 6 weeks, in 3 months, in 6, once you're somewhere in the middle of an ocean whose waves, in deep winter, can rise taller than a 4-story building. You can't quite picture it yet. Nobody can. The first time. What you can picture, lying there in the dark with your locker half unpacked and your porthole showing nothing but dockside floodlights, is the calendar. 9 months. 270-some days, give or take, before you set foot on solid, unmoving ground again. It is, you'll find, easier to accept in the abstract than it will be to live through in the particular, one identical gray day at a time. But that's tomorrow's problem, and the day after's, and the one after that. Tonight, there is only the hum of the idle engine 3 decks below you, the faint metallic tick of a cooling pipe somewhere in the wall, and the strange, settling knowledge that this room, this narrow steel box with its single small window onto the world, is now your home, for a very long time. You close your eyes. Somewhere above you, footsteps cross the deck, unhurried, routine, the sound of someone else's watch beginning while yours, mercifully, has not yet started. Sleep, tonight, comes easily. It's one of the last easy nights you'll have for a while, though you don't know that yet either. Outside, beyond the porthole, beyond the dock lights and the cranes and the last few lit windows of the harbor, the ocean is already waiting, patient and enormous, and entirely indifferent to the fact that you are, for the first time in your life, about to spend a winter living on top of it. You wake to a sound you didn't choose and can't turn off, a soft chime over the intercom, followed by a voice reading out the watch schedule for the next 24 hours. This, you'll learn quickly, is the true clock of the ship, and it has nothing to do with sunrise. A container ship in winter does not run on daylight, because daylight, in the North Atlantic between November and March, is a scarce and unreliable resource, arriving late, leaving early, often hidden altogether behind weeks of unbroken cloud. What the ship runs on instead is the watch rotation, a system older than the engines themselves, dividing the storms, at least, announce themselves. This slow dissolving of ordinary time creeps in unnoticed, and by the time you register it, 3 weeks have already vanished behind you, into the same gray, identical fog. Tonight, coming off your midnight watch, you walk back through corridors lit the same dim red they're always lit at this hour, past portholes showing nothing but black water and the faint, distant lights of another vessel far off on the horizon. You reach your quarters, and for a moment before you climb into your bunk, you stand at your own small window and try to remember, honestly, what day this is. You can't, quite. You decide, as you climb into your bunk and pull the blanket up, that it doesn't especially matter. Out here, there will be time enough, God knows, to lose track of every single one of them. The first real storm finds you 11 days out, somewhere north of the 40th parallel, and it does not announce itself gently. It announces itself as a ship that suddenly, violently, has an opinion about which way is up. You are off watch when it begins, lying in your bunk in the dim red glow of the corridor, light bleeding faintly under your door, and the first sign is not sound but sensation, a long, slow tilt that keeps tilting well past the point where your body expects it to stop. The ship rolls and rolls further, and for one suspended half-second at the top of the roll, you feel your own weight go strange and light before gravity reasserts itself and the whole hull comes swinging back the other way. This is what your bunk was built for. Raised lips along both long edges, just high enough that a sleeping body doesn't slide free with each roll. A design detail you'd barely noticed on your first night aboard and are now, for the first time, deeply and personally grateful for. Your locker door has a latch that clicks shut on its own. Your desk lamp is bolted down. Every loose object in your quarters that wasn't secured on your first day has, by now, either found its way to the floor or been wedged somewhere it can't move, because the ship, you've learned quickly, does not tolerate anything left to chance. What you're feeling tonight is what the crew simply calls weather, a word so understated it's almost funny, given that outside your porthole, invisible in the dark, waves are building toward heights that would swallow a 3-story building whole. The North Atlantic in winter doesn't produce chop, the small choppy waves of a summer squall. It produces swell, long, rolling mountains of water spaced sometimes hundreds of meters apart, each one lifting the ship's quarter-mile length and setting it down again in a slow, grinding rhythm that you feel less in your ears than in your stomach, your inner ear, the base of your skull. The engineers who designed this vessel accounted for exactly this. Ballast tanks distributed through the hull, filled and adjusted to keep her center of gravity low and stable even as she's tossed. Stabilizer fins extended now somewhere below the waterline, working constantly to dampen the worst of the roll before it reaches you. None of it eliminates the motion. It only makes the motion survivable, something the body can, with enough repetition, learn to sleep through. And that, more than anything, is the strange skill you're being asked to develop tonight. Sleeping through violence. Not metaphorical violence, the actual, physical, 1,000-ton lurching of a vessel being lifted and dropped by an indifferent ocean. New sailors, you've been told, often don't sleep at all through their first real storm, lying rigid in their bunks with every muscle braced, waiting for a wave that feels, each time, like it might be the one that finally goes wrong. Veteran sailors, the ones who've done 4, 5, 6 of these winter crossings, sleep through storms that would keep a landsman awake for a week straight, their bodies having long since learned to distinguish the ship's normal, survivable violence from anything genuinely dangerous. You are, tonight, still somewhere in between. You lie in your bunk, feeling the roll build and release, and you find yourself doing the thing every new sailor does. Counting the seconds between one roll and the next, listening for anything in the ship's groaning, creaking voice that sounds different from what you heard the night before. The sound world of a ship in a storm deserves its own kind of attention, because it is, in its way, as strange and enveloping as the motion itself. Steel doesn't stay silent under this kind of stress. It groans, long and low, as the hull flexes almost imperceptibly with each wave, an engineered flexibility that lets her absorb stress rather than crack under it. Somewhere forward, a loose fitting bangs rhythmically against a bulkhead until someone, eventually, gets up and secures it. The wind outside isn't a sound so much as a pressure, a constant deep howl pressing against the hull that you feel almost more than hear. And beneath all of it, unbroken, unbothered, the same low engine hum that's been running since the day you boarded, utterly indifferent to the chaos above and around it. 3 decks down, where a small crew of engineers is making absolutely certain it stays that way. You will learn, over the coming weeks, that this sound world becomes, paradoxically, a kind of comfort. The silence of a calm night, you'll find later in the voyage, is sometimes more unsettling than the storm. Too quiet, too still. A break in the ship's constant voice that your ears have grown to rely on without ever meaning to. Tonight, though, you haven't learned that yet. Tonight, you lie in the dark, timing the rolls, listening to the wind and the groaning steel and the distant clatter of something in the galley that someone will curse about in the morning. And you wait. The way every new sailor waits through their first real storm, for your body to simply run out of the energy required to stay afraid. It happens somewhere past 2 a.m. Your muscles, exhausted from 3 hours of unconscious bracing, finally surrender to the rhythm rather than fighting it, and the roll of the ship, instead of feeling like a threat, starts to feel almost like a rocking, the oldest, most primitive kind of comfort there is. You sleep, finally, somewhere in the small hours, lulled by the very motion that terrified you at midnight, and you wake for your next watch 4 hours later to a slightly calmer sea and the quiet, private knowledge that you've crossed some kind of threshold. You are, a little more than you were yesterday, a sailor now. If the crew's quarters are the ship's nervous system, delicate and cold and sensitive to every roll, the engine room is her heart, and hearts, it turns out, run hot, no matter how cold the world outside gets. You descend into it for the first time on a proper working watch about 3 weeks in, following one of the ship's 2 engineers down a series of steel stairwells that seem to plunge endlessly toward the bottom of the vessel, the temperature climbing with every level, the noise climbing faster still. By the time you reach the engine room floor, the cold that's been your constant companion since October, the cold that seeps through every corridor and bites at exposed skin on deck, has been replaced entirely by something else. A wall of heat and sound so total it takes a genuine physical effort to walk into it. The ship's main engine, a 2-stroke diesel the size of a small house, dominates the space, its massive pistons firing in a rhythm you feel in your chest before you consciously register it as sound. The engineers wear ear protection permanently down here, communicating in a shorthand of hand signals and shouted half words, because ordinary conversation simply doesn't survive the noise. The contrast, you realize almost immediately, is the whole point of the space, and also its quiet cruelty. Somewhere above you, on the open deck, the temperature tonight sits several degrees below freezing, a wind cutting off the black water that would drop the effective cold further still. Down here, the ambient temperature regularly climbs past 40 degrees Celsius, hot enough that engineers strip down to thin coveralls and still finish a watch soaked through with sweat. A sailor can move, in the space of a 10-minute climb, from a world trying to freeze him to a world trying to cook him, and both, in their own way, are simply Tuesday aboard a winter container ship. It is, you'll come to think, one of the strangest and most under-discussed truths of this whole voyage. The ship doesn't offer you a single climate to endure. It offers you 2, extreme in opposite directions, separated by nothing more than a few flights of steel stairs. The 2 engineers assigned to this crossing work in a rotation of their own, distinct from the deck watches, because an engine of this size, running continuously for 9 months without a single full shutdown, requires a kind of vigilance that never fully rests. Pressures monitored, temperatures logged, fuel systems checked and adjusted for the particular blend the ship burns in colder waters, where standard fuel can thicken and cause problems the engineers have learned, through hard experience, to anticipate rather than react to. In genuinely severe cold, even the engine room's tropical heat can't fully protect certain systems from the temperature of the seawater used to cool them. Seawater that in the depths of a North Atlantic winter can approach the freezing point itself. The engineers speak of this, when they speak of it at all, with the calm, unbothered fluency of people who have simply seen it all before. Frozen intake lines, thickened fuel, the dozen small mechanical griefs that winter visits on a ship's machinery, each one requiring not panic but procedure. A checklist followed calmly at 3 a.m. by 2 exhausted men who know, better than anyone else aboard, that the entire vessel's survival rests quite literally on the engine beneath their feet, never, ever fully stopping. You spend 2 hours on this watch simply learning the space, the engineers walking you through gauges and valves and the deafening, half-shouted logic of a system that has kept ships like this one crossing oceans for the better part of a century. What strikes you most, climbing back up toward the cold at the end of it, isn't the heat or the noise, though both will stay with you. It's the strange intimacy of the space. 2 men spending 8, 10, 12 hours a day in a roaring, superheated chamber that the rest of the crew rarely visits and thinks about even less, quietly keeping the ship's one indispensable organ beating through weather that would, without their unglamorous and largely unwitnessed vigilance, leave 22 people stranded and powerless in the middle of the coldest ocean on Earth. You climb the last stairwell, and the cold hits you again, sudden and clean after the engine room's thick heat, and for a moment you simply stand there on the open landing, feeling your sweat turn cold against your skin, caught between the ship's two extremes, and grateful in a way you hadn't expected to be for both of them. By the 5th week, you've learned that the coldest work aboard this ship doesn't happen in a storm. It happens in the quiet, brutal aftermath of one, when the wind has dropped and the swell has eased, and someone still has to go out onto the open deck and deal with the ice. Ice on a ship this far north in winter isn't decoration. It's danger, accumulating steadily on every exposed surface, every rail, every hatch cover, every piece of deck machinery, freezing spray hardening the moment it lands into a layer that thickens with every wave that breaks over the bow. Left unaddressed, that ice does more than make footing treacherous, though it certainly does that. It adds weight, meaningful weight, distributed high on the ship's structure, exactly where weight is least welcome, and enough of it, accumulated over enough hours, can measurably affect a vessel's stability, a fact every sailor aboard understands with a seriousness that borders on reverence. So the ice gets chipped away, by hand, in weather that makes the task itself dangerous. A small crew moving methodically along the exposed deck, with mallets and scrapers, clearing rails and hatches and walkways one section at a time. You're assigned to this detail for the first time on a gray afternoon, with the temperature well below freezing and a wind that finds every gap in your cold weather gear within minutes. The gear itself is substantial. Insulated coveralls, a heavy jacket rated for conditions far harsher than most people will ever experience, gloves thick enough to blunt your fingers' sense of feel, a harness clipped to a jack line that runs the length of the exposed deck, because the ship's role, even in relatively calm conditions, is more than enough to put an unsecured person into the North Atlantic, and the North Atlantic in winter offers no second chances. You clip in before you start, the way you've been trained to, the way every sailor on this detail does without exception, because the sea out here doesn't forgive carelessness and doesn't wait for anyone to learn that lesson twice. The work itself is simple in concept and exhausting in practice. Ice, once it's built up, doesn't yield easily. It has to be struck, worked, chipped free in stubborn fragments that skitter away across the deck and over the side, the mallet's impact ringing dully through gloves too thick to transmit much feeling. You work a section of rail for 20 minutes and feel it in your shoulders for the rest of the day. The cold works on you constantly, even through the gear. A persistent ache that settles into fingers and toes despite every precaution, and the wind carries spray that finds its way past your hood and down your collar with a kind of patient, personal malice. Conversation, out here, is minimal, both because the wind swallows most of it, and because there's a discipline to this work that doesn't leave much room for chatter, a focus that every sailor learns to maintain, because the alternative, a moment's inattention on an icy, rolling deck 299 meters from the nearest solid ground, is not a risk worth taking. What you notice, working the ice detail through your first full watch of it, is the particular kind of tiredness this labor produces, different from the tiredness of a long night watch or a disrupted sleep schedule. This is a physical exhaustion, earned honestly, muscle by muscle, the kind that leaves you almost grateful for your narrow bunk and its raised edges when the watch finally ends. And there's something else too, something you won't fully articulate until much later in the voyage, a quiet pride in the work itself, unglamorous and largely invisible to anyone who isn't aboard, but genuinely, materially necessary. Every pound of ice you clear from that rail is a pound the ship doesn't have to carry into the next storm. Every hour spent out here in weather that punishes exposed skin within minutes is an hour that keeps the whole vessel and everyone aboard her a little safer than she'd otherwise be. You finish the detail as the light, what little of it there was, begins to fail. The gray sky sliding toward the deeper gray of a winter evening at sea. You unclip from the jackline, make your way back toward the nearest hatch, and pause for just a moment before going in. Looking out at the rail you spent the last hour clearing, already in the falling temperature, beginning to gather the faintest new skin of frost. Tomorrow, or the day after, someone will be back out here doing it again. That's the rhythm of it. You're beginning to understand. This entire 9-month winter, not one dramatic battle against the cold, but 1,000 small, patient, repeated ones, fought quietly, by hand, by a crew of 22 people who understood long before you joined them that the sea doesn't care how tired you are, and the only real defense against that indifference is simply showing up, again and again, and doing the unglamorous work anyway. Somewhere around week 7, deep into your first true stretch of the 12-to-4 rotation, you climb the internal stairwell to the bridge for a midnight watch, and you discover, for the first time, what real solitude aboard a container ship actually feels like. The bridge at midnight is nothing like the bridge at noon. By day, it's a working space, the officer of the watch moving between instruments, occasional radio traffic crackling through, the wheelhouse window showing an ocean that, however vast, at least has the decency to be visible. At midnight in deep winter, with the nearest other vessel likely dozens of miles distant, and the nearest scrap of land further than that, the bridge becomes something closer to a chapel, or perhaps a cockpit orbiting a planet with no other lights on it. The overhead lighting is dimmed to almost nothing, a deliberate practice to preserve your night vision so that the only real illumination comes from the soft glow of the instrument panels, the radar sweep circling patiently in its green arc, the chart display tracking your position with a small, steady pulse, the compass repeater ticking off headings no one but you is watching. Beyond the windows, there is nothing. Not blackness exactly, but an absence so total it takes weeks to stop feeling strange. An ocean and a sky that have, at this hour, in this weather, simply merged into a single undifferentiated dark. You are, for the 4 hours of this watch, functionally alone. Not literally. The ship's 21 other souls are somewhere below you, sleeping or working or eating in the same steel hull, but functionally, meaningfully alone, standing watch in a glass box suspended above an ocean that stretches, unbroken, for 1,000 miles in every direction. This is, you'll come to understand, one of the strangest paradoxes of life aboard a vessel this size. You are never truly alone. 21 other people share every cubic meter of this world with you, and yet for 4 hours at a stretch, twice in every 24, you are as solitary as it is possible for a human being to be, while still technically employed. The instruments become, in these hours, a kind of company of their own. You learn to read the radar not as an abstract green sweep, but as a living record of everything around you. The faint returns of distant weather systems, the occasional bright echo of another vessel far off on the horizon, invisible to the naked eye but perfectly visible here, a small and oddly comforting proof that you are not, in fact, entirely alone on this ocean, merely alone within your own small steel world. You learn to check the chart plotter's slow crawl of position, not out of anxiety, but out of something closer to ritual, a way of marking the passage of time in a watch that otherwise offers no other markers at all. 4 hours can feel, on a bridge like this, at an hour like this, like either the longest stretch of time in the world or a strange, dreamlike blur that's over before you've properly settled into it. And which one it becomes seems to depend less on the weather outside than on the state of your own mind, because that, more than the radar or the compass or the endless dark water, is what this watch really asks of you. The discipline of vigilance sustained against a sea that offers, most nights, absolutely nothing to be vigilant about. Nothing happens, hour after hour, night after night, and yet everything about the job depends on your remaining exactly as alert in hour 4 as you were in the first 10 minutes. Because the one night something does happen, an unexpected vessel crossing your path, a piece of weather building faster than forecast, a mechanical alarm from somewhere below, is precisely the night that vigilance matters most, and it never announces in advance which night that will be. Veteran officers speak of developing a kind of sixth sense for the ocean at night, an intuition built from thousands of hours of watching nothing happen that lets them notice, almost before they consciously register it, the one thing that's different. You don't have that yet, 7 weeks in. What you have instead is discipline, deliberate and effortful, the conscious choice, made over and over through the small hours, to keep scanning the dark water and the green radar sweep with the same care in the 4th hour as the first. There is, in this solitude, something you didn't expect to find, a kind of peace. Not comfort, exactly. The bridge at midnight in a North Atlantic winter is rarely comfortable, but a peace that comes from the sheer scale of what surrounds you, an ocean vast enough to swallow every worry you carried aboard with you, a darkness complete enough that the small concerns of your life on land, quietly, without your quite noticing, begin to recede into something more distant and more manageable. You find yourself, in the 4th week of standing this watch regularly, almost looking forward to it, not despite the solitude but because of it, a 4-hour stretch in every 24 that belongs entirely to you and the instruments and the vast, indifferent dark, with no conversation required, no company to manage, nothing to do but watch and think, and let the ship carry you steadily onward through a night that will, eventually, without any particular fanfare, simply become morning. You come off this watch a little before 4, descending the stairwell back into the ship's warmer, more populated lower decks, and you pass another sailor heading up to relieve you, exchanging a brief nod, a few words about the sea state before you continue on toward your bunk, and he continues up toward the same glass box, the same instruments, the same vast and patient dark. The watch continues, has continued since the ship left port, will continue until she reaches it again 9 months from now. You, tonight, were simply the one holding it. It's somewhere around the 2-month mark that the isolation stops being a fact you know, and starts being a feeling you carry, and the two things you're discovering are not remotely the same. You knew before you boarded, in the way anyone knows a fact from a brochure or a briefing, that this voyage would mean 9 months without land, without the ordinary textures of a life lived among more than 21 other people. You'd nodded along to it, signed the contracts, packed your bags, treated the isolation as a condition of employment, a line item alongside the pay and the leave schedule. What you didn't know, couldn't have known, is what it actually feels like to be 2 months into that isolation, standing at the rail during a rare calm afternoon, watching an ocean that stretches unbroken in every direction, and to feel, quite suddenly and without warning, the full weight of just how far you are from everything and everyone you've ever known. It doesn't arrive as a single dramatic moment, this feeling, not for most sailors. It arrives instead as a slow accumulation, small absences stacking quietly on top of each other until, somewhere around week 8 or 9, their combined weight becomes impossible to ignore. The absence of new faces, having seen the same 21 people day after day for 2 months straight, every mannerism and habit and small quirk of speech grown entirely familiar. The absence of choice in food, in company, in how you spend an evening. Everything aboard a ship this size determined in advance by rotation and routine, and the simple physical limits of the space. The absence, most of all, of your own life continuing to happen around you the way it does on land. Birthdays and small crises and ordinary Tuesday evenings unfolding somewhere far away, in a world you've stepped out of for the better part of a year, a world that, you know, intellectually, is continuing along perfectly well without you, and yet somehow feels, from out here, oddly suspended, waiting for your return before it properly resumes. Sailors speak of this stretch, the 2nd and 3rd months of a long winter crossing, as the hardest psychological terrain of the entire voyage, harder in its way than the physical demands of the storms or the ice or the exhausting watch rotation. The novelty of the ship has worn off by now. You no longer notice the engines hum the way you did that first night. No longer marvel at the scale of the vessel or the strangeness of the watch schedule. And the end of the voyage, 7 more months away, remains too distant to offer any real comfort. A horizon so far off, it barely registers as real. You're caught, in these weeks, in a kind of middle distance, too far from the beginning to draw comfort from its novelty, too far from the end to draw comfort from its approach, simply present, day after identical day, in a life that has narrowed down to this ship, this ocean, this small and unchanging company of faces. What helps, and it does help, though never completely, is the discipline of routine, the same daily structure that felt so alien in your first weeks aboard becoming, by month 2, something closer to scaffolding, a set of fixed points around which the otherwise formless days can be organized. Watch, meal, maintenance, sleep, watch again. Each block a small, manageable unit of time that doesn't require you to think about the 7 months still ahead, only about the 4 hours immediately in front of you. Sailors who struggle most with this stretch of isolation, the officers tell you, are often the ones who let their minds drift too far forward, counting down the full remaining months, rather than simply living the day, the watch, the hour in front of them. You start, without anyone explicitly teaching you to, doing the same, measuring your remaining time not in months but in watches, a mental trick that shrinks an unbearable distance down into something that can actually be carried. There's a particular quality to the light in these weeks, too, that seems to mirror the feeling exactly. The sun, this far north in deep winter, barely clears the horizon before beginning its slow retreat again. 4 or 5 hours of gray, filtered daylight sandwiched between long stretches of dark. You find yourself standing at the rail during those brief, bright hours, more often than you did in the first month, not for any particular reason, just to be present for the light while it lasts, a small, unspoken ritual that several other sailors, you notice, seem to share, each of you drawn separately to the same stretch of deck during the same thin window of afternoon sun, standing a respectful distance apart, saying little, simply absorbing what daylight the season is willing to offer before it withdraws again into the long winter dark. You go back inside, eventually, as you always do, back to the watch schedule and the mess hall and the narrow, familiar corridors. The isolation hasn't lifted, hasn't been solved by an afternoon at the rail, but it has, in some small way, been acknowledged, carried a little more lightly for having been witnessed, and that, you're learning, is often the most that's possible out here. Not a cure for the distance, but a way of holding it that doesn't let it become unbearable. The satellite phone sits in a small locked room just off the bridge, and twice a week, for a strictly rationed handful of minutes, it becomes the single most important object on the entire ship. Communication with home, aboard a vessel this far from land, is neither simple nor free, and every sailor learns quickly to treat their allotted minutes with the same careful discipline they'd apply to any other limited resource. The system works on a rotating schedule, a sign-up sheet posted near the mess hall. Each crew member allotted a modest window, perhaps 20 minutes, twice a week, sometimes less depending on how many are aboard and how the satellite link is behaving in weather that can degrade a signal as easily as it can degrade almost everything else out here. You learn, in your first attempted call home in week 3, just how strange it is to compress an entire life, weeks of storms and ice details and midnight watches, into 20 rationed minutes with someone standing 4,000 miles away in a kitchen you can picture perfectly and haven't set foot in for months. The calls themselves carry a peculiar weight because of their scarcity. On land, a phone call is a casual thing, made and ended without much thought, one of dozens of small connections that fill an ordinary week. Out here, a phone call is an event, anticipated for days beforehand, replayed in memory for days afterward, every word chosen with more care than the format really requires, simply because there won't be another chance for 3 or 4 more days, and because the person on the other end is carrying, in their voice alone, the entire texture of a world you can no longer see or touch or verify for yourself. Only imagine, based on what fragments make it through a compressed and often crackling satellite connection. Some sailors, you learn, find these calls comforting beyond measure, a lifeline that makes the whole voyage bearable. Others find them, paradoxically, harder than not calling at all. The brief immersion in a home life they can't participate in, making the return to the ship's isolated routine that much sharper. By contrast, you fall, in your own experience, somewhere between the two, grateful for every minute of connection, and also, quietly, relieved each time the call ends, and you can settle back into the ship's rhythm without the ache of that other world still fresh in your ears. There is no single right way to carry this distance you're discovering, only the way that happens for each sailor to hurt the least. Letters, strange as it sounds in an era of satellite phones, still matter aboard a ship like this, written and saved rather than sent, since there's no reliable way to post anything from the middle of an ocean, but composed anyway, in spare moments during off-watch hours, addressed to people who won't read them for months, a private ritual that several of the older crew members swear by more than the phone calls themselves. There's something in the slower, more deliberate act of writing, they tell you, that suits the ship's rhythm better than the compressed urgency of a rationed phone call, a way of processing the strange, suspended texture of this life at the pace it actually deserves, rather than the pace a 20-minute call forces on you. And then there are the smaller comforts, the ones that don't require any connection to shore at all. A well-worn deck of cards in the rec room, a chess set with several pieces replaced by mismatched substitutes over the ship's long service life, a small shelf of paperbacks traded and retraded among the crew until every spine is soft and every cover familiar. Someone, you learn, has been quietly maintaining a small herb garden in a converted storage locker near the galley, a handful of pots under a grow lamp, basil and mint pushing up defiantly against an ocean that offers nothing green for 1,000 miles in any direction, tended daily by whoever has a spare few minutes and needs, badly, to care for something small and living and entirely under their control. It is, you come to understand, watching him check the soil one evening between watches, not really about the herbs at all. These small rituals, the cards, the letters, the herb garden, the same handful of films watched and rewatched in the rec room, don't erase the distance from home. Don't make 9 months feel like 9 weeks. What they do, patiently, unglamorously, night after night, is give the ship's 22 isolated souls something to hold on to that isn't simply the passage of time itself, a set of small, repeatable comforts that make the space between one satellite call and the next feel survivable even, on the better nights, something close to peaceful. By month 3, something has shifted among the crew that you didn't notice happening, and that nobody could have manufactured on purpose. You have become, without any of you quite deciding to, something close to a family. It isn't friendship in the ordinary sense, not exactly. Not the kind built from shared history or chosen affinity. Most of these 21 other people you'd never have crossed paths with on land, different countries, different languages layered atop the ship's working English, different lives entirely before this voyage brought you all together into the same steel hull. What's grown between you instead is something stranger and, in its own way, sturdier. The particular bond that forms among people who depend on each other, absolutely and without alternative, for their safety and their sanity, for months on end, with no possibility of simply walking away from a disagreement or taking a few days apart to cool off. You are stuck with each other, all 22 of you, in the most literal sense possible, and somewhere in the second month, that fact stopped feeling like a constraint and started feeling instead like the foundation of something real. It shows up in small ways first. The way conversation in the mess hall has grown easier, less effortful. Jokes now landing on the first telling instead of needing explanation. References understood instantly because you've all lived by now through the same storms and the same ice details and the same long stretches of watching the same gray ocean. The way someone notices, almost before you do yourself, when you're having a harder week, the isolation pressing a little heavier than usual, and finds some small, unspoken way to ease it. An extra portion at dinner, an offer to cover part of a watch, simply sitting a little longer at your table than the conversation strictly requires. The way birthdays get marked, however modestly, a cake improvised from the galley's limited winter stores, the entire off-watch crew crowding into the mess hall for 20 minutes to sing badly and eat cake that tastes, everyone agrees, exactly like every other cake the galley has produced this voyage, and somehow, that night, tastes like more than that anyway. The engineers, the deck crew, the officers, each group has its own particular rhythm and its own particular humor, forged in the specific pressures of their specific work. But the boundaries between them, you notice, have grown porous in a way they weren't in the first weeks. An engineer coming off a brutal watch in the engine room's heat finds himself, an hour later, playing cards in the rec room with 2 deckhands who spent that same watch out on the ice detail, the shared exhaustion of the day dissolving whatever formal distance their different jobs might otherwise maintain. Rank still matters, of course, has to matter, on a ship where clear lines of authority are the difference between order and chaos in an emergency. But off watch, in the mess hall and the rec room and the quiet corridors at odd hours, something more level has taken hold. 22 people who have stopped, in any meaningful sense, being strangers to each other. You think sometimes, standing your midnight watch alone on the bridge, about how strange it is that this particular kind of closeness required this particular kind of isolation to grow. On land, surrounded by choice and company and 100 casual distractions, you might have known these same 21 people for years and never grown half this close. The ordinary texture of a fuller life, leaving less room, less need, for the kind of daily, undiluted reliance that a ship like this simply demands. Out here, with nowhere else to turn and no one else to turn to, you've all, without quite meaning to, built something that functions very much like family, imperfect and occasionally irritable and entirely involuntary, and also, on the nights that matter most, genuinely, quietly sustaining. You come off watch a little before midnight, on this particular night, and find 3 others still awake in the rec room, a card game winding down, low laughter carrying down the corridor toward your quarters. You pause in the doorway a moment, not quite ready to head to bed, and someone waves you in to fill the 4th seat before the game breaks up entirely. You sit. 6 more months of this ocean stretch out ahead of you, unknowable, and somewhere in this small, warm room, for the length of one more card game, that distance feels, for a little while, entirely manageable. The worst storm of the entire voyage arrives in early January, and it arrives with almost no warning at all. The kind of North Atlantic system that builds faster than the forecasts predict and leaves a crew with hours rather than days to prepare. You've weathered a dozen storms by now, enough that the ship's motion in rough seas has become, if not comfortable, at least familiar, a known quantity your body has learned to work with rather than fight. This one is different from the first hour, and every experienced hand aboard seems to sense it almost before the barometer confirms it. A particular heaviness to the air, a swell arriving from an angle that doesn't quite match the wind. Small signs that mean nothing to you yet, but clearly mean a great deal to sailors who've crossed this ocean a dozen winters running. The captain calls an early briefing. The whole off-watch crew gathered in the mess hall for 10 tense minutes, and the instructions are simple and absolute. Everything gets secured. Nothing loose remains anywhere aboard, and nobody, under any circumstances, goes out on deck alone for the duration. By the time the storm fully arrives, some 6 hours later, the ship is taking waves that the more seasoned crew members estimate, in low, careful voices, at somewhere close to 15 meters, 4-story swells that lift the bow high enough to blot out the horizon entirely before dropping it again into the trough with a shudder that travels through the whole quarter-mile length of the hull. You're off watch when the worst of it hits, secured in your bunk with everything in your quarters lashed down or stowed, and for the first time since boarding, you feel something closer to real fear than the manageable unease you've grown used to. The ship groans under this stress in a register you haven't heard before, deep and prolonged, the sound of a hull engineered for exactly this kind of punishment doing precisely the job it was built to do, though knowing that, intellectually, does very little to steady a stomach that's beginning to understand, on a much more primitive level, just how small this vessel is against an ocean determined to remind everyone aboard of the fact. On the bridge, through the worst hours, the officers work in a state of total, unbroken concentration, adjusting course and speed constantly to meet the largest waves at the angle least likely to strain the hull, a skill built from years of experience that no instrument can fully replace. Below, in the engine room, the 2 engineers hold their positions through the entire ordeal, monitoring systems that are, in weather like this, working harder than at almost any other point in the voyage, because a loss of power now, in seas this size, would leave the ship broadside to waves capable of rolling her, a scenario nobody aboard allows themselves to dwell on aloud, though everyone, in their own private way, is aware of it. You lie in your bunk through the worst of it, listening to the ship's deep, groaning voice, feeling your own weight shift and strain against your raised bunk edges with each roll, and you find yourself doing something you haven't done since your very first storm back in October. Praying, in a loose, unpracticed way to whatever might be listening, that the hull holds, that the engine keeps running, that the next 4 hours pass the way every other storm on this crossing eventually has. They do. Somewhere past 3 in the morning, the worst of it begins, almost imperceptibly at first, to ease, the interval between the largest waves lengthening, the ship's motion easing from violent to merely rough. By dawn, gray and reluctant as it always is this far north in January, the storm has moved on ahead of you, leaving behind a heavy, exhausted swell and a crew that emerges from a night of tense, unbroken vigilance looking, every one of them, 10 years older than they did the evening before. The damage report, when it comes in over the morning briefing, is remarkably light. A few loose fittings, some minor water intrusion in a forward compartment, nothing that threatens the voyage. It could, everyone aboard understands without needing to say it aloud, have been very different. What stays with you longest from that night isn't the fear, though the fear was real and will return in smaller doses every time the barometer starts to drop unusually fast for the rest of the crossing. What stays with you is the crew's response to it, the total absence of panic, even in the worst hours, replaced instead by a kind of grim, practiced competence that you realize only now has been building the entire voyage. Every drill, every routine watch, every small procedure followed correctly 100 times over, existing precisely to be ready for a night like this one. You come off watch the next morning into a mess hall quieter than usual, everyone moving a little slower, a little more carefully, processing in their own private way what the ship and the ocean had just put them through together. Someone makes a joke, eventually, the way sailors always eventually do, and the tension breaks, just slightly, and the day continues, because it has to, because 7 more months of this crossing remain, and the only real choice, out here, is to keep going. Christmas Eve finds you 4,000 miles from anyone who shares your language of home, and the ship, in its own improvised way, does everything it can to make the distance a little smaller. There's no pretending, this far into deep winter isolation, that a holiday spent at sea feels anything like a holiday spent on land, and the crew doesn't try to pretend otherwise. What they do instead, in the days leading up to it, is build something of their own, a version of the season shaped entirely by what's actually available aboard a container ship in the middle of the North Atlantic, rather than by what's missing. The galley, working with a winter's worth of carefully rationed stores, produces a dinner on the 24th that everyone agrees is the best meal of the entire voyage so far. Not because any single ingredient is special. Most of what's aboard has been frozen or preserved for months by this point, but because of the evident care that's gone into it, a small mess hall decorated with whatever modest ornaments the ship happens to carry from voyage to voyage, strung lights borrowed from a maintenance locker, and every single off-watch member of the crew crowded around tables pushed together for the occasion. Someone produces a battered guitar that's apparently made every winter crossing this ship has run for the past 6 years, and the singing that follows dinner is enthusiastic rather than skilled. Carols sung in at least 4 different languages, sometimes simultaneously, everyone laughing more than singing correctly, and nobody minding in the slightest. It's a strange, improvised, deeply imperfect version of the holiday, and also, you find, watching it unfold around you, a genuinely moving one. 22 people from a dozen different backgrounds, finding common ground in the simple, universal human instinct to mark the darkest, coldest stretch of the year with light and food and company, even 4,000 miles from anywhere that instinct originally comes from. The watch schedule doesn't stop for Christmas, of course. The ship's rhythm indifferent to the calendar, the same way it's indifferent to every other ordinary marker of time. And someone has to be on the bridge at midnight, regardless of what the date happens to be. There's a quiet, unspoken generosity in how this gets handled. Senior crew members volunteering for the least convenient watches so that others can be present for more of the evening's celebration. Small acts of consideration that speak, more than any decoration could, to just how far the crew's bond has grown over the past 3 months. You draw the midnight watch yourself this year, and you don't especially mind it. Climbing to the bridge a little after the singing has wound down, carrying with you a small paper plate of the evening's leftovers that someone pressed into your hands on your way out the mess hall door. Standing your watch that night, the bridge dim and quiet, the ocean stretching black and unbroken beyond the windows, you find yourself thinking about every other Christmas Eve you've ever spent, all of them, without exception, on solid ground, surrounded by people who share your history, rather than merely your circumstances. This one is different from every one of those, and stranger, and in its own particular way, no less meaningful for being so. Somewhere below you, the last of the crew are drifting off to their bunks, full and tired, and for one evening at least, a little less far from home than the actual distance would suggest. You check the radar, log the position, watch the slow crawl of the chart plotter mark another few miles of an ocean that doesn't know or care what night this is. And somewhere around 1 a.m, the satellite phone room briefly occupied by someone else taking their turn at a rationed call home, you catch, faintly, through the closed door, the sound of a voice speaking softly in a language you don't understand, warm and clearly happy despite the distance, and you think, standing alone at the helm of this vast, quiet ship, that perhaps the holiday has done exactly what a holiday is supposed to do, out here as much as anywhere. Reminded 22 isolated people, for one evening, that they are loved by someone. Somewhere, however far away that someone happens to be. By late January, deep into the crossing's 5th month, a particular kind of fatigue has settled over the ship that has nothing to do with any single storm or any single hard watch, and everything to do with simple, patient accumulation. Sleep debt, the officers tell you, is the quiet enemy of every long winter crossing, more dangerous in its way than any single storm, because it doesn't announce itself the way a storm does. It builds instead in small increments. An hour lost here to a rough sea that made proper rest impossible. An hour lost there to a watch that ran long because of some minor mechanical issue that needed attention before anyone could stand down. A dozen small deficits accumulating week after week, until by month 5, most of the crew is operating on a sleep reserve that would alarm anyone measuring it from the comfort of a stable bed on land. You notice it first in small things. A slight fog behind your eyes by the end of a watch that wouldn't have troubled you back in October. A tendency to need the coffee in the mess hall a little stronger, a little more often than you once did. The ship, to its credit, and the crew alongside it, has developed its own quiet strategies for managing this accumulated debt. None of them perfect, all of them at least partially effective. Officers watch each other and watch the crew under them for the particular signs of accumulated fatigue that matter most in a working environment like this one. Small errors, slowed reactions, a shortened temper, catching them early enough to adjust a schedule or insist someone take an extra rest period before the deficit becomes genuinely dangerous rather than merely uncomfortable. There's a frank, unsentimental culture aboard around admitting when you're running short. None of the bravado you might expect from an environment built around physical endurance and hard weather, because everyone aboard understands, at a level deeper than pride, that a tired sailor on an icy deck or a fatigued officer on a midnight watch isn't a personal failing to be concealed, but a genuine risk to the entire ship, and risks like that get named plainly and addressed quickly, because the alternative is unthinkable. You develop your own private rituals for managing it, the way every sailor eventually does. A short, deliberate walk along the interior corridor before a watch. Not for exercise exactly, but simply to shake off the heaviness of interrupted sleep before stepping into 4 hours where alertness genuinely matters. A strict, almost superstitious discipline around your own 8-off watch hours, protecting them the way you'd protect anything scarce and valuable, resisting the pull of a card game or a film in the rec room when your body is telling you, honestly, that it needs the bunk instead. A cup of the galley's strong, slightly bitter coffee, taken at the same point in every watch, less for the caffeine itself than for the small, reliable comfort of a fixed ritual in days that otherwise blur together with almost nothing to distinguish one from the next. What surprises you most, this deep into the accumulated exhaustion of a long winter crossing, is how manageable it actually proves to be, provided it's acknowledged rather than denied. The crew that emerges from month 5 isn't a crew running on empty, despite the very real sleep debt every one of them is carrying. It's a crew that has learned, collectively and individually, how to run a genuine deficit without letting it become dangerous, watching out for each other in small, constant, largely unspoken ways, covering for a shipmate who's clearly running short, offering an extra hour's rest where the schedule allows it, treating fatigue as a shared problem to be managed together rather than a private weakness to be hidden. You lie in your bunk one evening in late January, genuinely tired in the particular accumulated way that 4 months of interrupted sleep produces, and you find, to your own quiet surprise, that you're not especially worried about it. You've learned by now that this ship and the people running her know exactly how to carry this kind of weight, and have been carrying it every winter for as long as vessels like this one have been crossing this ocean at all. The engine alarm sounds at 2 a.m. in early February, a sharp, insistent tone that pulls you out of a sound sleep before your conscious mind has even registered what the sound means. And for the next 90 minutes, you watch this entire crew do exactly what 4 months of drills and routine and hard-won trust in each other have prepared them to do. It's a fuel system fault, you learn quickly, gathering in the corridor outside your quarters with several other off-watch crew members, all of you drawn by the alarm and the sudden, purposeful movement of officers heading toward the engine room stairwell. Not catastrophic. Not yet, but serious enough that the 2 engineers on duty need every available hand who has relevant training, and serious enough that the ship's main engine has been temporarily throttled back while the fault is diagnosed, a fact that registers in the pit of your stomach with real weight, because an engine running at reduced power in the North Atlantic in February is not a small thing. Not with weather systems capable of building faster than any forecast can properly warn for. What strikes you most, standing in that corridor in the small hours, isn't the alarm itself, alarming as it is, but the total absence of panic in how the crew responds to it. Officers move with brisk, purposeful urgency rather than fear. The engineers, when you glimpse them descending toward the engine room, are focused and calm, already running through the diagnostic sequence that months of drills have made close to automatic. someone quietly organizes the off-watch crew members gathered in the corridor, not because there's necessarily a task for all of you, but because a ship in a genuine situation functions better with everyone accounted for and ready, rather than scattered and uncertain. You find yourself standing next to one of the deckhands you've grown closest to over the past months. Neither of you saying much, both of you simply present, ready, watching the corridor toward the engine room for whatever news comes next. It comes eventually, a little over an hour later, a fouled fuel filter, a known failure mode in cold weather operation, identified and cleared by the two exhausted but entirely composed engineers. The main engine brought back to full power in a careful, monitored sequence that takes another 20 minutes to complete properly. The whole event, start to finish, resolves in under 2 hours, and by the time the all-clear passes quietly through the ship, most of the gathered crew members are already drifting back toward their bunks, the adrenaline of the interrupted sleep beginning to fade into the particular, bone-deep tiredness of a night that asked more of everyone than it should have. What you carry away from that night, more than the specific mechanical details of a fouled fuel filter, is a clearer, more visceral understanding of exactly what this crew, this ship, this whole strange floating community has actually built together over 4 months of shared isolation, in a moment of genuine, unscripted uncertainty. 22 people who came aboard as strangers responded not with panic or disorder, but with calm, practiced competence, each person understanding their role and trusting completely that everyone else understood theirs. This is what the endless drills and routines of the earlier months were actually for, you realize, standing in your quarters afterward, still too keyed up from the interrupted sleep to drift back off immediately. Not to fill idle hours with busy work, but to build patiently, watch by watch and week by week, exactly the kind of trust and readiness that a night like this one demands, and that this crew, when it mattered, delivered without hesitation. You finally drift back to sleep sometime past 4, the engine's steady hum, restored now to its full and familiar rhythm, carrying you down into rest the way it has, almost every night since October. By March, deep in the 7th month, something changes in the quality of the light, so gradual you almost miss it, and it becomes, without anyone quite announcing it, the first genuine sign that this winter, endless as it's felt, is finally beginning to loosen its grip. You notice it first on an otherwise unremarkable watch, standing at the bridge windows a little after 4 in the afternoon and realizing, with a small jolt of surprise, that there's still real daylight outside, pale and thin, but daylight nonetheless, at an hour that back in December would have already surrendered fully to dark. The sun, this far north, has been climbing back toward the horizon by degrees too small to notice day to day, and yet here, suddenly, is the accumulated evidence of months of that slow climb, an extra hour of light that wasn't there before, arriving so quietly that you can't point to the exact day it happened, only to the fact that it clearly has. The crew responds to this shift with something you haven't seen in months, a lightness, faint but unmistakable, threading through the mess hall conversations and the watch handovers, a sense that the deepest, darkest stretch of the crossing has been survived rather than merely endured. Nobody says this aloud, not exactly, sailors being generally disinclined toward that kind of open sentiment, but you catch it in smaller signs. A joke that wouldn't have landed in January lands easily now. Someone starts a small, informal pool on the exact date the crew will finally sight land again, scrawled on a scrap of paper pinned in the rec room, numbers filled in with the kind of hopeful specificity that would have felt almost cruel to indulge 2 months earlier. The herb garden in its converted storage locker, tended faithfully all winter, has finally produced enough basil for someone to make, with evident ceremony, a proper batch of pesto for the whole crew's dinner, a small green flourish against months of preserved and frozen stores that feels, everyone agrees, disproportionately significant for a condiment. This shift in light brings its own particular psychological relief, one that the ship's older hands recognize immediately, and the newer crew members, yourself included, discover for the first time. The deep isolation of the winter's darkest months, you're realizing only now in retrospect, was compounded significantly by the darkness itself, the psychological weight of standing a midnight watch that might as well be a noon watch for all the daylight difference of walking the exposed deck in near total dark even during what should be the middle of the afternoon. An extra hour of visible daylight doesn't change the fundamental facts of the voyage. The isolation is exactly as complete as it was in January, the ocean exactly as vast, but it changes something in how that isolation feels to carry, a small, tangible proof that time is, in fact, still moving forward, that the world's larger rhythms haven't abandoned you out here after all. The weather, too, begins its own slow shift, not gentle exactly. The North Atlantic in March remains a genuinely hostile stretch of ocean, but marginally less brutal than the deep winter storms of December and January, the swells slightly less mountainous, the ice detail slightly less frequent, though far from unnecessary. You find yourself standing at the rail during the newly extended daylight hours more often now, not out of the same quiet desperation that drove you there in the darkest months, but out of something closer to simple pleasure, watching the light play differently across water that spent months looking uniformly gray, and now, in these longer afternoons, occasionally shows genuine color, a deep, cold blue that you'd almost forgotten the ocean could produce. You think, standing there one afternoon in the strengthening March light, about how strange this whole crossing has been to actually live through, compared to how you'd imagined it back in September. You'd braced yourself, before boarding, for the physical hardship, the storms and the ice and the punishing schedule, and all of that had arrived, exactly as hard as you'd expected. What you hadn't braced for, couldn't have braced for, was the slower, quieter psychological terrain, the way isolation compounds not in dramatic moments, but in patient accumulation, and the way, correspondingly, relief arrives the same way, not as a single dramatic turning point, but as a gradual, almost imperceptible loosening. An extra hour of light here, a slightly calmer sea there, small accumulating signs that the worst of this particular winter has, in fact, been survived, and that somewhere ahead, still months distant, but no longer quite so abstractly distant, land is waiting. 2 months from the voyage's end, in the middle of April, the crew begins, almost without discussing it directly, a quiet process of psychological preparation for a transition that every experienced sailor aboard already knows will be harder than anyone expects. It seems, on its face, like it should be simple. 9 months of isolation ending, land approaching, home finally within reach. But the older hands aboard, the ones who've done this crossing multiple times, speak of the final weeks with a particular wry caution that the newer crew members, yourself included, don't fully understand until you're living through it yourselves. The ship, for all 9 months, has been a genuinely difficult environment, isolated and demanding and physically punishing in ways large and small. It has also, over those same 9 months, become entirely familiar. Its rhythms and rituals and narrow, predictable geography absorbed so completely into your daily existence that the prospect of leaving it however eagerly anticipated, carries its own quiet, unexpected weight. You notice this most clearly in conversations that have started appearing in the mess hall over the past few weeks. Sailors speaking about home, with a complicated mixture of longing and something closer to apprehension, wondering aloud, half joking and half serious, whether they'll know how to function in a world with more than 21 other faces in it, whether the particular, hard-won closeness built with this crew over 9 months of shared hardship will survive the return to ordinary lives lived at a normal, unisolated distance from each other. Someone remarks, one evening, that she's slightly dreading the sheer sensory overload of a proper grocery store after 9 months of the ship's carefully rationed, repetitive stores, the sheer volume of choice feeling, in the imagining, almost as overwhelming as the isolation itself once did. There's a particular psychological phenomenon the officers mention, casually but with evident seriousness, that experienced crews watch for in these final weeks, a kind of premature relaxing of the discipline that's carried everyone safely through the previous 8 months. A tendency, as land draws closer and the finish line becomes tangible, to let vigilance slip just slightly. Exactly the wrong moment for it to do so, since the final weeks of any long crossing remain every bit as capable of producing a genuine storm or a genuine mechanical crisis as the first. The captain addresses this directly in a briefing in mid-April, calm and measured, reminding the crew that the voyage isn't over until it's over, that the ocean doesn't grade on effort or duration, and that the discipline built over 9 hard months needs to hold for the final weeks exactly as firmly as it held for the first. You find yourself, in these final weeks, engaging in a private accounting you hadn't expected, mentally cataloging the small rituals and routines that have structured your existence for the better part of a year, wondering which of them you'll actually miss once they're no longer available to you. The particular quality of a midnight watch's solitude, the camaraderie of the mess hall's staggered meal sittings, even, strangely, the ice detail, brutal as it always was, carries with it now a kind of nostalgic weight, a physical hardship endured alongside people who, over 9 months, became something closer to family than colleagues. You suspect, without quite being able to articulate why, that some part of this experience, the specific texture of this particular isolation, this particular crew, this particular winter, will never entirely leave you, whatever comes next. The ship itself, meanwhile, continues its steady, indifferent progress, exactly as it has since October, the engine's constant hum beneath every conversation, every meal, every private moment of anticipation or apprehension about the return ahead. There's something almost comforting in that continuity, you think, standing your watch one evening in the strengthening spring light. The vessel herself, entirely unmoved by the psychological churn happening among the small crew she carries, simply doing, as she has for 9 straight months, exactly what she was built to do, carrying this odd, tight, exhausted, transformed community of 22 people steadily onward, mile by mile, toward a homecoming that every one of you, in your own private and complicated way, is only now beginning to properly imagine. The last true storm of the voyage arrives in the final week of April, a smaller system than January's ordeal, but arriving, cruelly, at precisely the moment the crew least wants any further reminder of the ocean's power, and the way this crew meets it tells you everything about how far you've all come since October. There's an irony everyone aboard acknowledges wearily when the barometer starts its familiar downward slide, after 9 months of storms, after the genuine ordeal of January, after every hard-won lesson this ocean has taught this crew about vigilance and discipline and respect. Here comes one more test, arriving in the final stretch when every instinct is pulling toward relaxation rather than readiness. But the response, when it comes, bears almost no resemblance to the tense, uncertain preparations of that first storm back in October. Everything gets secured with the brisk, automatic efficiency of 9 months of repetition. The watch schedule adjusts without confusion or complaint. The engineers descend to their posts with the same calm thoroughness they've brought to every watch since the beginning, exactly as capable now, at the end of this crossing, as they were on day one, if not more so. You stand your own watch through part of this final storm, and you notice, with a kind of quiet satisfaction, how different your own body feels compared to that terrified first night in October. The roll that once sent your stomach lurching toward panic now registers as simply weather, uncomfortable and demanding respect, but no longer genuinely frightening. Your body having learned, over 9 months, exactly the difference between a ship working hard and a ship in real danger. The sounds that once kept you counting seconds through a sleepless night, the groaning steel, the distant clatter of secured objects shifting slightly against their restraints, now register almost as familiar background, the ship's known voice, rather than an alarming unknown one. What strikes you most, watching this final storm move through the crew, is the almost casual competence with which everyone handles it. A stark contrast to the tense, careful uncertainty of the early months. Sailors move through the storm's worst hours doing exactly what needs doing, without visible fear, without the kind of white-knuckled bracing you remember from your own early weeks aboard. This is what 9 months has actually built, you realize, watching an engineer crack a small, dry joke in the corridor, even as the ship pitches hard beneath both your feet. Not merely a crew that has survived a difficult winter, but a crew genuinely, deeply transformed by it. Each person carrying now a hard-won, embodied competence that no amount of pre-voyage training could have provided in advance. The storm passes, as they all eventually do, leaving behind the usual aftermath of exhausted relief and a fresh round of maintenance work, checking for damage, securing anything that shifted, the familiar unglamorous labor that follows every storm this crossing has produced. But there's something different in how the crew handles this particular aftermath. A lightness underneath the tiredness, the shared, unspoken recognition that this was very likely the last real test this voyage will demand of them. One final storm, weathered with the full, hard-earned competence of 9 months' experience, standing between this crew and a homecoming that, for the first time, feels genuinely, tangibly close, rather than abstractly distant. You find yourself, in the storm's aftermath, standing at the rail during a break in your watch, looking out at a sea that's calming rapidly behind the departing system, and you think about the version of yourself who stood at a very similar rail back in October, uncertain and slightly afraid, unable to picture what 9 months of this life would actually feel like to live through. That version of you, you realize, couldn't have imagined this, couldn't have imagined the particular, hard-won confidence you're carrying now. The particular closeness built with 21 people who were strangers when this voyage began. The particular, complicated pride of having weathered, quite literally, everything this ocean chose to throw at you across 9 unbroken winter months. Whatever comes next, in these final days before land finally appears on the horizon, you carry that forward with you, and it feels, standing here in the storm's fading aftermath, like the truest measure of what this whole voyage has actually been about. Land appears on the horizon on a gray, ordinary morning in early May, and the moment when it finally arrives after 9 months of unbroken ocean is quieter and stranger than anyone aboard quite expected it to be. It starts as the smallest possible mark on the horizon, barely distinguishable from a low bank of cloud, and word travels through the ship in minutes anyway. Sailors drifting up toward the bridge wing and the open deck in a loose, quiet gathering, off watch and on watch alike, all of you simply standing, watching a smudge on the horizon slowly, gradually resolve itself into something unmistakably solid. Nobody cheers, exactly, which surprises you a little, given how many months you've all spent anticipating this exact moment. What actually happens instead is quieter, more contemplative. 22 people standing at the rail in a loose, comfortable silence, each of you processing, in your own private way, the strange, almost unbelievable fact that the horizon, unbroken water for 9 straight months, finally contains something else. The final approach takes the better part of the day, land growing steadily more distinct, a coastline resolving into individual features, and the crew's mood shifts gradually across those hours from quiet contemplation into something more like genuine, if still somewhat subdued, celebration. There's cake in the mess hall again, another improvised galley creation, and someone produces the battered guitar one more time, though the songs tonight carry a different energy than Christmas Eve's homesick carols, something closer to triumph. 9 months of shared hardship, finally, tangibly, coming to its conclusion. You find yourself standing in the mess hall doorway, watching this loose, happy gathering, thinking about every single one of the months that led to this particular evening. The October uncertainty, the January storm, the deep isolation of the darkest winter weeks, the slow, hard-won closeness built across 1,000 small shared moments. None of you could have anticipated when you first boarded. The final hours before docking bring their own particular bittersweet quality, the ship's familiar routines continuing right up until the very end. One last watch rotation, one last meal in the mess hall's staggered sittings, the engine's constant hum, still running exactly as steadily as it has since October, now audibly, finally, beginning to slow as the ship approaches port. You stand your own last watch on the bridge in the small hours before docking. The same instruments you learned to read as strange and unfamiliar back in October, now feeling like old, trusted companions. And you find yourself in this final solitary watch, genuinely moved by the strangeness of an ending that's felt for the past 9 months, almost unimaginably distant, arriving now with a suddenness that catches you slightly off guard despite every day of anticipation that preceded it. Docking itself, when it finally happens the following morning, is almost anticlimactic in its practicality. Lines secured, gangway lowered, the familiar bustle of port operations resuming around a ship that spent 9 months in a world entirely removed from any of it. The crew disperses in the following hours with a mixture of relief and something more complicated, embraces exchanged in the corridors and on the gangway, contact information, traded between people who, whatever happens next in their separate lives, will carry this particular winter and this particular crossing with them permanently. You find yourself, in your final hour aboard, standing once more in your narrow quarters, the same small steel room that felt so alien back in September, packing the same modest collection of belongings you arrived with 9 months earlier, and you pause, before you leave, to simply stand there a moment, taking in this small space one last time, the space that carried you, quite literally, through the hardest and strangest and in some ways most meaningful 9 months of your life so far. There's a particular moment, standing in your empty quarters on that last morning with your bags packed and the ship's familiar hum still running steady beneath your feet, when you finally understand what this vessel actually was to you, underneath everything else it also happened to be. For 9 months, you'd thought of her, when you thought of her at all in those terms, as simply the ship, the vessel, the workplace, the thing that carried cargo and crew alike across an ocean that wanted neither there. It was easy in the thick of it, in the exhausting middle of a long winter watch rotation, or the white-knuckled hours of a January storm, to see her as an obstacle as much as a shelter, a hard, demanding, unforgiving piece of machinery that asked more of you than almost anything you'd done before. But standing here now, in this last quiet hour, looking back over 9 months compressed suddenly into something you can almost hold in your mind all at once, you see her differently. Not as an obstacle, as a sanctuary, the only one available, out there, and for that reason, one of the most complete you may ever know. Think about what she actually did, this steel hull, across those 9 winter months. She took a wind that could strip skin in minutes and kept it, mostly, on the far side of a few inches of plate steel and insulation. She took waves the height of buildings and absorbed them, flexed against them, groaned under them, and never once let them inside. She took a crew of 22 strangers and gave them, deliberately, by design, a warm mess hall to gather in, a bridge from which to watch a hostile ocean from the safety of glass and instruments, an engine room whose roaring heat stood in permanent, defiant contrast to everything freezing above it. Every single design choice you learned about across this crossing, the raised bunk edges, the ballast tanks, the stabilizer fins, the sealed and heated corridors, existed for exactly one purpose: to take an environment that actively wanted to kill everyone aboard and make it, instead, merely difficult, survivable, livable even on the better days. That is not a small thing for several 100 meters of welded steel to accomplish, and it is worth, on this last morning, actually pausing to marvel at it. There's a version of this voyage's story that's only about hardship, and it wouldn't be false, exactly, just incomplete. Yes, you endured cold that worked its way through even the best gear, storms that tested a lifetime's worth of nerve in a single night, a sleep debt that accumulated quietly for months, an isolation that pressed harder in February than it ever had in October. All of that happened, and all of it was real. But sitting alongside every one of those hardships, inseparable from them, was this other fact, quieter and easier to overlook, that a small, deliberate, engineered world had been built specifically to carry 22 people safely through exactly this kind of winter, and it had done its job. Every night you slept through a storm that would have terrified you in October, you were sleeping inside a design that had been built by people you never met, specifically so that you could. Every watch you stood on that glowing, solitary bridge, you were standing inside a structure engineered to give you visibility and shelter at once, vigilance without total exposure. The ship's harshness and the ship's shelter were never really separate things. They were the same steel, doing the same job from 2 different angles. You think, too, standing here in these last minutes, about the particular kind of sanctuary that isn't architectural at all, the one built not from steel and insulation, but from 21 other people who started this voyage as strangers and ended it as something closer to family. The mess hall's staggered meals, the Christmas Eve singing in 4 overlapping languages, the card games that ran long past when anyone strictly needed to be awake, the quiet, wordless understanding that grew, watch by watch, month by month, between people who had no choice but to rely on each other completely and who chose again and again, in 1,000 small, unremarked ways, to make that reliance into something warmer than mere necessity. That, too, was shelter. Perhaps the truest shelter this whole voyage provided, the one that had nothing to do with hull plating or ballast tanks at all, and everything to do with what 22 people built together simply by choosing, night after night, to show up for one another. You take one last look around the narrow steel room that held you through all of it, the same room that felt so alien and cold back in September, and you find that you don't feel the urge to hurry out of it the way you might have expected. There's a strange, unhurried gratitude in this last moment. Instead, a recognition that this small, unglamorous space, 3 decks down, 1 dinner plate porthole, a bunk with raised edges built to keep you from sliding into the floor during a storm, was never simply a container for your body through 9 difficult months. It was the specific shape sanctuary took, out here in a winter with no other options. You pick up your bag. Somewhere above you, the last of the crew are gathering on deck, ready for the gangway, ready for solid ground. You take a final breath of the ship's familiar, faintly metallic air, and you go to join them, carrying with you, whether you fully realize it yet or not, a version of shelter you'll likely spend a long time afterward trying, and mostly failing, to properly explain to anyone who wasn't there. So here we are, at the quiet end of a very long winter. You boarded a container ship in late September, a stranger to 21 other strangers, uncertain what 9 months of isolation aboard a floating steel world would actually demand of you. You stood watch through storms that lifted your bunk 40 feet and dropped it again, night after night, until your body learned to sleep through violence that would have kept you rigid with fear back in October. You chipped ice off frozen rails in weather that punished exposed skin within minutes, worked a fuel filter fault at 2 in the morning with a crew that had learned, through 9 months of shared hardship, to move together without panic or hesitation. You watched the light slowly return in March after months of near-total winter dark, and you felt, more than you expected to, the particular ache of a Christmas Eve spent 4,000 miles from everyone who shares your history. And through all of it, watch after watch, storm after storm, you became something you weren't back in September. Not merely a sailor who had crossed a hard ocean, but a member of a small, tight, hard-won family, built entirely from shared isolation and shared endurance, in a place where such families have no other choice but to become entirely real. Spare a thought tonight for the sailors living this right now, somewhere out on the same dark winter ocean, standing a midnight watch in a glass box suspended above 1,000 miles of water, or holding steady in an engine room's roaring heat while ice gathers unseen on the deck far above them. They do this every winter, season after season, largely unphotographed and rarely thought of by the world, whose goods their ships quietly carry across the harshest water on Earth. Their solitude is real. Their discipline is real. And the strange, hard-won family they build together, 22 strangers becoming, over 9 unbroken months, something that functions very much like home, is real too. However far from any ordinary definition of home it might appear from the outside. As you settle into your own bed tonight, still and steady beneath you, unmoving in a way you'll perhaps never have quite noticed before, take a moment to feel the simple, profound stillness of a floor that isn't rolling 40 feet in either direction. It's a small comfort, and it's entirely yours. Sleep well. You have no watch to stand tonight, no ice to chip before the next storm arrives, and no vast, dark ocean waiting outside your window. Just rest. You've more than earned it.